Well, hello there. In this episode of Frank Weber's Party, I'm going to tell you a little story about how TV and watching a lot of TV as a youth and even as a little bit older person has affected my life. And then we're going to get into a review of the old Vegas detective show from the late 70s and early 80s starring Robert Urich. My favorite actress, Priscilla Barnes, has a prominent role in that one, and we think you're really going to enjoy this party, so stick around and enjoy. Welcome once again to Frank Weber's Party. So glad that you can make it to the party this week. This is our third party, and so glad that you could be here. I hope that you're sharing this with your friends and family, hitting subscribe. We've got a lot of great things going on in this show for you today. I'm going to start off once again with another personal story of mine, give you a little perspective on what I would call TV's effect on me. And I actually can use some examples of television from the past to illustrate this. And there's a lot of guys, probably a lot of girls too, who can tell you they watched a lot of TV growing up and have watched it change and evolve over the years. If they took the time to analyze it and how it might actually have affected them as they've moved forward in their lives. There used to be a show on HBO, as an example, about 30 years ago called Dream On, which starred Brian Benben. And I believe he was either a writer or maybe a author, which I'm actually writing a book of my own right now, a sci-fi comedy. I don't think I've said that in the first two episodes. Hopefully be out here before too long. But Brian Benben's character, the running joke or theme throughout that show from start to finish, the several years that it was on, he would run into a situation in real life and he would have this flashback to a time when his mom put him in front of a TV and he was watching shows from the 50s and 60s, and he would just flash back to some random scene from a TV show that he was watching. And so that TV obviously affected him in that way. And the other interesting thing about Brian Benben is that he married Madeline Stowe, who was a beautiful brunette. She was in a number of movies, and last I checked, they were retired and still living in Fredericksburg, Texas, down in the hill country, a ways from where I am. It tells you about TV's effect on people, and I would say movies too. Anything in the arts can be used to convey a meaning about how life could be, or at least get you thinking about how life could be, and how it is and how it could be better and that sort of thing. And that's the good part of all this and what I'm doing in these TV reviews. Whether it turns out to be a good show or not, or have any effect on me, the good part of it is that it gets you thinking and that you can maybe see how life can be and maybe make your life better, perhaps, is what I'm trying to say. And then, of course, on the flip side, there were also things about television that were not real life, and it can kind of affect you in some other ways that maybe weren't so good. The example that I used, I was just telling a friend of mine this the other day. I got interested in girls at an early age, even before puberty. I used to, this topic may come out in later episodes, but I used to chase them around the playground and even kiss them or try to kiss them and that sort of thing. And a lot of that, I think, came from a couple of places that I've just recently been reminded about. One of them was the Richard Dawson Family Feud, which I know to some people and some women was very controversial because Richard Dawson kissed all the women on the lips. I think they could opt out of that beforehand, but typically that was his way. I thought it was cool. He said later that that's what they did at his house growing up, and I think he was totally honest about it. I totally believed him, and I thought that was cool. I thought that was the way things were supposed to work. Okay. You can't blame me for that, right? And then at the same period of time, I've also noticed getting into the Three's Company reruns again, and I watched some of that show when it was brand new, especially the Priscilla Barnes years. And Jack was always very affectionate with his roommates. They would hug and kiss, and sometimes they would kiss on the lips. Nothing was generally that passionate. There might have been a couple of times, actually, now that you mention it, but generally, if it's a platonic relationship, they're not usually kissing like that as much as they are. But again, I figured, hey, I guess that's the way it really is. That's great. I think I'm going to do that. And so I had some fun, got into some trouble, that sort of thing in my early school years, even before puberty, like I was saying. And that expectation, of course, was fun, but it also got me in trouble as I got older and wanted to date, and found out that not everything works out the way it does on TV. It's not always a happy ending, and a lot of times it's a struggle. And as good as TV was or movies were, and they had a happy ending and people fell in love and lived happily ever after and whatnot, there was still some challenges and some things that still never worked out perfectly. And so anyway, I just wanted to share that with you. It had a big effect on my life, just like it did on Brian Benben's character in Dream On, who I believe was named Martin Tupper, like the Tupperware. I think it was his name. And anyway, I just wanted to share that with you, just give you a little thought. We're going to have more little stories like that in the future. And of course, obviously, there's going to be a ton of stories. Planning on getting some interviews here before too much longer. Like I said, every show is a little bit different, though, and to try to produce some content for you each and every week, and that I think you'll enjoy. So I'm going to take a quick break right here, and then we'll come back and review an episode from the Robert Urich detective show Vegas from 1980, where Priscilla plays a very prominent role. All right, welcome back to the show. We're going to do another review of a production that Priscilla Barnes was in today. We're not really doing these in any particular order. Last time we did her appearance on Columbo, an uncredited appearance, because that was her very first acting gig, I believe. And today we're going to do an appearance in Vegas. That's a detective show starring Robert Urich that started in 1978. The S in Vegas is replaced with the $. It's not the James Caan show from the early 2000s, also called Vegas. And today I picked this one because this particular episode seems to be pretty outrageous, I would say, in terms of plot and storyline and some acting and dialogue, and I think we can have a pretty good time with it. So let me start with an overview and history of the show. So it's called Vegas. It's an Aaron Spelling detective show from the era, starring Robert Urich, and it aired from 1978 to 1981. This episode is called Love Affair, and the third and final season, this is episode 5, that aired November 26th of 1980. Dan Tanna is the name of the detective that Robert Urich plays, and it started as part of a Charlie's Angels episode called Angels in Vegas to start their new season in 1978. He makes an appearance in it, and the following week you have a new show called Vegas that he stars in, and that's how it all got started. It's essentially a cool guy detective show, 1 hour long every week, with Dan Tanna, as we said, as the main character. Like many shows in that era, especially Aaron Spelling shows, he had a lot of great guest stars, and often had a beautiful guest star or girlfriend for one episode that he seemed to be in love with. And in addition, he also had a beautiful assistant named B that was played by Phyllis Davis, who was in pretty much every episode. He never hooked up with her, though. That was the format for a lot of years in Hollywood. You have this studly, handsome protagonist, detective in this case, guy who would go through all these girlfriends and love interests each episode and even have a beautiful assistant, but never hooked up with the assistant, and they'd have to move on from one girl to the next, essentially. Overall, I thought the show was always a really good concept. Now it's really good to get a glimpse of the old Vegas, the way it used to be. Obviously, the skyline and the buildings are so different now, and I would say even the gambling to some extent. So it's good from a nostalgic point of view. But the writing and acting were not quite as good in this show. And it may have been one of the reasons why it only lasted about 3 years. It may have also been in part because Aaron Spelling, who was churning out lots of different shows in the 70s and 80s, had several other detective shows going on at the same time. Like, for instance, Charlie's Angels, and I believe Starsky and Hutch, which was definitely also a Spelling production, was still around during the first season of Vegas. That may have been another reason, and that's not even counting, all those shows were on ABC, that's not even counting what might have also been on CBS and NBC at the time. So, let's go ahead and get into some characters and the actors who played him. Of course, the main star is Robert Urich, also I call him Bob Urich. Knew him a lot from the Magnum Force movie, which starred Dirty Harry. He was one of 3 bad cops, vigilante cops, along with David Soul, who's in Starsky and Hutch, and also Tim Matheson, who was in Animal House and a number of other things. And also in some other shows. He was in the sitcom Soap for a short time, a little bit before this, and then, of course, later the detective show Spencer for Hire. And then also in the late 90s, not too terribly long before he passed away, he was the captain in The Love Boat, The Next Wave, which I think was one of those UPN shows. Dan Tanna was a really interesting guy, the character he played. He was a Vietnam vet. He had a 57 red Ford Thunderbird convertible, and he lived this great bachelor's lifestyle out of the Desert Inn's theatrical warehouse, where he had a little area made for his living quarters, and he also had an area for his Thunderbird to park, but it wasn't a garage, it wasn't walled off or anything. So I always wondered how they managed to do that and prevent carbon monoxide poisoning and things like that. And he probably was able to live there in the Desert Inn theatrical warehouse because of his friendship with the inn's owner, whose name was Philip Roth, I believe, and he was played by Tony Curtis, a huge star, Jamie Lee's dad. But Tony is not in this episode, and it turns out he was not in a lot of the Vegas episodes back when it was on. But Dan, he takes a variety of different cases, but he tends to not want to take cases involving divorce or bodyguard cases, so that's just important to know. And then other cast members that were still on the show at the time of the 3rd season, some of them had left before the 3rd season, were Greg Morris, who was the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Lieutenant Nelson. Greg Morris was also known for being on the original Mission Impossible with Peter Graves. He's the contact at the police department, works well with Dan Tanna. And then, as I mentioned, the lovely Phyllis Davis, who's from Port Arthur, Texas, down southeast by the coast there, was his assistant B, and a lovely, lovely woman. And then there was Bart Braverman, who played Benzer, who was also a contact or an assistant for Dan Tanna. So all these stars were largely TV stars, except for Tony Curtis. He did a lot of movies as well as a lot of TV. And of the regular cast that we're mentioning right now, only Bart Braverman is still around. So I just wanted to point that out to you. And then as far as the guest stars, and this is one of the things that really is intriguing to me, is you have your regular stars, but you have your guest stars, and it's always interesting to see who they were and what else that they were in during their careers. The main one here is Dick Sargent, who is actually playing Phil King, who's a stockbroker who apparently has turned to being a pimp for high-priced call girls in this particular episode of Vegas. He's best known for being the second actor to play Darren Stevens on Bewitched. And he was in an episode of Three's Company fairly early on. I think it was actually second season, though, as a married man who was trying to have an affair with Chrissy, Suzanne Summers' character. And in the Three's Company episode, he was married to Joyce Bulifant, who had some connection to the Mary Tyler Moore Show and Gavin MacLeod and that. And then she was in Airplane, and there's a huge connection there. It's kind of interesting. But Dick Sargent, he had many acting credits. I remember approximately around this time, 79 or 80, he was a substitute sheriff on the Dukes of Hazzard for Roscoe. Because a lot of folks on that show had some kind of pay disputes or some kind of acting disputes and so forth that are fairly well known. And he filled in for one episode. And typically I knew him as kind of a goofy, comedic kind of actor, but he could play some very serious roles. And he was definitely very serious in this role as Phil King in this episode of Vegas. We also had Ruta Lee, who played a character named Gloria Garland, who was a former call girl for Phil King in this episode. She's an actress, but also a singer and dancer. Very many credits as well. She was on Three's Company twice, both as a real estate agent, but actually different characters. The first time she sold the apartment building for Mr. Roper, and I believe that was the episode where she did this very distinct phrase, "Whoa, please," when somebody suggested that she was potentially having an affair with Roper, all through misunderstanding, of course. And then the second time she was a real estate agent as well, she wound up trying to screw Furley out of the apartment building, or at least his brother Bart, who actually owned the building. So that was always interesting there. She's well into her 80s now. I think just had a birthday not all that long ago. She's still around. Dick Sargent is not. The next guy I'm going to talk about is not either. His name is Steve Sander. He played Tony, who was one of King's henchmen, essentially. A really big, muscular guy. He was on an episode of Three's Company as well, played an overprotective brother of a girl Jack was interested in and, I guess, essentially dating. Steve Sanders' character owned a gym where his sister also worked in that Three's Company episodes. He has a few credits, but seemed to kind of disappear a lot after about 1990. I may be wrong about that, but I wasn't really sure to find a whole lot of stuff on him. He starred on a second season episode of the original Star Trek. And then finally of note, and this lady is still alive and around today, is Patty Davis, who plays a receptionist for Phil King, apparently takes orders for stocks, as well as books the appointments for these call girls. And of course, this is Ronald and Nancy Reagan's daughter, a very attractive woman. I had a few acting credits, but mostly was an author of books. She had a lot of disagreements with her parents that are well noted, and had a spread in Playboy in the mid-90s or so that was kind of a big deal. I'm going to try not to give too many spoilers or tell you exactly what happens at the end, but I do think it's kind of outrageous, and I'll go through the general gist of things, and then it's really kind of a bullshit plot. TV obviously stretches reality. Sometimes it goes into fantasy, and sometimes that's good and desirable. Basically, at the beginning of the show, Tanna has met Pam, who is Priscilla Barnes' character in this show. And they have fallen in love. We didn't really see them meet or anything, but they're definitely in love. And Pam is very educated, either a psychology student or a lecturer. We're not really sure exactly which one. And at least 2 times a week, she has to go study at the library, give a lecture 2 nights a week. So she can't always be with Dan Tanna, but apparently Tanna thinks she should. Turns out Though we find out later that she's a $5,000 a night call girl for Phil King, and her name is Satin, which sounds like a really crazy, sexy stage name. And Phil King, as I said, is a stockbroker mainly, but has turned into a pimp when he realized that he could get high-class educated women to service these Johns after a basically economic downturn. So the premise is already getting ridiculous there. And I feel like the story was not real written. There was a hooker at the beginning of the show that is killed by King. I think her name was Marcia something. I don't know if that was her stage name, though. And she had Tanna's number for help about what King was actually doing and trying to kind of investigate him and get him into trouble. But Tanna, of course, was busy with Pam at the time doing, who knows, romantic stuff. Tanna finds out about this job of Pam's when he goes to the Desert Inn trying to look for his owner and friend Phil Roth, who, like I said, is not in this movie. And as she is leaving, this is her second stint with a guy named Frederick Barr, who's the John in this case. She's leaving his room. He's a rich oil man from Texas. Essentially, Dan and Pam break up, have a huge discussion at the casino and then a parking lot. They break up, and then they slowly, after a couple of scenes, they get back together. Then Pam decides that she will quit working for King because she's so in love with Dan and has made life very meaningful for her. But then Barr really wants another night with her, calls King at 4 a.m, and even that's too late for Phil King, and suggests, that, hey, let me pay $100,000 for the night instead of the regular $5,000 rate. And of course, all this is split between King and the call girl. Then Pam goes to King to quit. And then some things ensue that I won't quite get into here. I want to keep some element of surprise in case you're interested in going to check it out. So I'll stop the recap there. So that just reveals that this is the type of show that the main character has a love interest or a girlfriend. She's there for one time and that's it. That was the formulaic approach to it. Even if that main character also had a beautiful assistant he could potentially hook up with, but they never got together. And I also should mention before I go through an analysis of certain scenes that, in case you're looking at it, there's still a Desert Inn road in Las Vegas, but the Desert Inn is not there anymore. I believe Steve Wynn bought it in the late 90s, and it's now the Wynn Casino and Resort, and probably the Encore as well, since they're right next to each other. So in case you start wondering about that. So go through a few scenes here before I go through my final synopsis. Dan Tanna has a really cool answering machine that picks up the phone on its own and then records the person speaks into the phone, and then it records the message. And while that might be very obsolete now, especially when we have smartphones with voicemails, that was a pretty cool thing in 1980. They actually got to a point where you didn't have to pick up the phone in order to have an answering machine separate that recorded. But it was really interesting. He had a lot of cool gadgets like that. It wasn't a James Bond, but it was very cool. Early on, there's a pillow scene where Pam and Dan are still in bed, and then there's a bubble bath scene that they're taking together. Pam and Dan, they have a good chemistry, or at least an average to good chemistry, but the dialogue is just terrible. Especially terrible for Bob Urich, and I felt sorry about saying that because he's not here anymore, not here to defend himself. And then I was also concerned about the general acting and emotion that he showed throughout the show. Maybe it was just an off week. There definitely seemed to be some other Vegas episodes where it was better. He told a corny joke in bed that I didn't understand, and then they mentioned it again when they went to make up on a golf course, which I'm going to get into in just a second. But then they were in the bubble bath together, and then he told this really crazy joke about, well, Pam, like a lot of women, they'll ask, have there been any other women in this bubble bath with you? Because that's what a lot of women like to do. And he said, oh yeah, just one. It was a female plumber named Bubbles who helped hook up the bubble bath. And then they decided to test it out by taking a bath together. And I guess you can see some humor in it, but I don't know if it's genuinely great. There was a picnic scene before Pam was found out, and then later a makeup scene. Both appear to take place on a golf course and not a park, especially the second scene where you can see golfers and the golf carts in the background. And Dan has basically in that second scene driven his 57 red Thunderbird convertible onto the golf course. So I thought that was really unusual to see that. I'm sure the groundskeepers were probably not too thrilled, but again, probably worked out okay since it's a TV show and probably had to ask permission for it first. I would also note here, we're going to go actually a couple other scenes here. Also noted that Phil King has an indoor pool at his place. A lot of lovely women walking around, basically in one-piece swimsuits. My guess is that they're not call girls. And he and his associates like Tony the henchman seem to be playing a lot of poker there, or otherwise just card games. Seems like that's all they apparently do while they make money at stockbroking and getting these call girls sent out to these high-priced businessmen. I would tell you to pay special attention to the last scene at the boxing gym. It was probably one of the worst bits of dialogue and acting that I remember seeing from Dan Tanna in the entire show. And basically the conclusion is reached for the show. He's very upset, obviously frazzled. A lot of things have just happened. But even the boxers who are there to work out, and they seem to be big, strong, physically tough guys or whatever, even one of them comes over to the side of the ring and seems like he's genuinely concerned about Dan. Maybe he feels a little sorry for him. It's almost kind of comedic in that regard. And then at the very end, they try to put a little bow, almost a happy ending on it. And Tanna, B, and Benzer go fishing in a boat. And of course, Pam is not there. You have to watch the show to find out really what happens with her. They did that a lot back then just to make the show seem somewhat of a happy ending. Can't say it really was. So I just want to give an overall grade for the show. Like I said, I like the premise. I think it's a cool show. Dan Tanna's a cool guy, cool job, working in Vegas. This particular episode, I'd probably give a C for it. Priscilla's acting in it, I would probably give her a B. I know I'm very kind to her, but I thought she actually did a really pretty decent job. And then I have a couple of finishing thoughts here. And so hopefully I gave you enough here to tell you how this plot and storyline and some of the acting here was pretty outrageous. I don't want it to turn you off for other episodes in the series, but still streaming. I think it may be on YouTube, and I know there's at least one channel that's showing it these days. I just wanted to give you a little comment on it here. So you're talking about a guy like Phil King. I don't know what kind of stockbroker he was, but it seems like this would be a fairly unlikely business model. I think most men and women who are educated and have other things going on in their career that they enjoy and that take up most of their time would probably not stoop to being prostitutes or call girls or hookers, whatever you want to call them. There may be exceptions, but there's something that keeps that from happening, even if the money is relatively easy. There could definitely be some exceptions out there, but people get into doing something that they like. In Pam's case, it was psychology and learning psychology. Maybe she was going to be a therapist or a researcher or whatever. So very unlikely, kind of outlandish in that regard. And During the breakup scene, when they're in the parking lot at the Desert Inn, one of the quotes that Pam says is, "I'm not cheating, I'm working." And that, of course, is a bit out of reality as well. Typically, whether it's this country, I know we value it highly in this country, but I think it's true in a lot of other places. People like religious people and people with values, they don't enjoy cheating. Basically, if you're fucking somebody else and you're in a committed relationship, that is typically considered cheating. So that was an odd scene. Kind of rationalizes it, actually. And rationalization is one of those psychology terms, in fact. And then the last thing that I would tell you, most call girls and hookers, again, there may be exceptions, but most of them don't look like Priscilla Barnes, nor do they look like the Marcia that was killed at the beginning of the episode. I don't really know why exactly that is. Usually there is a hardened look to a lot of the people who engage in that business, and they usually have to wear kind of sexy clothes and a lot of makeup and stuff to look attractive. As a comparison, and this will be my last point before I wrap this up, but like I was recently watching another comedic classic musical that's been on a little bit on TV recently, The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, which starred Burt Reynolds and Dolly Parton. And of course, Dolly Parton ran the Chicken Ranch in Texas, which was a real place. And the ladies in that show, they weren't really knockout, drop dead gorgeous like Priscilla, but they weren't terrible either. I mean, they were pretty average to good looking, I would say. And that was probably a good compromise for that episode. I think I'm going to stop right here, get some more episodes ready for you here, and hope you enjoyed it today, and look forward to seeing you at the party once again really soon. And remember, tell your family and friends and have them hit that subscribe button. And this is your host, Frank Weber, signing off, and talk to you again soon. The theme song is called Retro Funk by Soul Prod Music and can be found at pixabay.com.